They say the Middle Ages were filled with mystery, castles, knights, and holy vows. But buried beneath those vows lies something far darker, something almost no history book dares to mention. Imagine a bride, young and radiant, her gown heavy with pearls, yet across her lips, not a smile, not a kiss, but cold, unyielding iron, a gag. Why were these women silenced? Was it superstition? Control? Or a secret ritual meant to erase their voices forever? The truth is, no one really knows. The only evidence we have are these eerie wedding masks. These are real artifacts from the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. Historians have found over 60 of them in European museums and private collections. But why were they used? Some historians believe they were a symbol of the bride's obedience. Others think they were a way for the groom to keep his bride quiet during the ceremony, so that he could hear the vows being spoken. But there's another, even darker theory. Some historians believe that these gags were used to prevent the bride from screaming during the consummation of the marriage. And if that's true, then these objects are more than just a piece of metal. They're a symbol of a dark and disturbing part of history that we should never forget. Have you ever heard of a bridal gag? In the great stone halls of medieval Europe, they used to say that a bride's silence was worth more than her voice. And to ensure a woman's silence, they invented an instrument of restraint, small, cruel device of polished metal clasped tight across the mouth. Some say the practice began in the Rhineland, where paranoid feudal lords feared that their new wives might betray secrets. Others insist it began in the French duchies, where the church demanded silence and obedience from Christian wives. But the truth is something much darker. The gag was not just for silence, it was for transformation. A girl who crossed the threshold into a nobleman's house became someone else's property, body and soul. And the bridal gag was the key to that transformation. They would lock the gag behind the girl's head, and once fastened, only the husband or his kin held the key. And so the bride wore the gag not only on her journey to the altar, but sometimes for days afterwards, a grotesque inversion of virtue. Pain mistaken for piety, obedience purchased by suffering. They say that every bride is beautiful, but in the Middle Ages they took it to a whole new level. Historians, of course, will tell you that such tales are exaggerated, inventions of moralists and zealots. They will point to the lack of surviving devices, the absence of a clear decree. But absence is not innocence. In the damp cellars of certain castles, rusted bands have been found that resemble no common tool. And in abbey records, scribes wrote cautiously of bridal bindings, quickly crossing out the words as though afraid to leave them legible. What was being hidden, and why? Picture the scene. A young woman, no more than 16, led to her husband's hall. Her hair is braided, her gown stitched with pearls, and across her mouth, a glint of iron beneath her veil. The guests applaud, the priest blesses the union, and no one dares to speak of what they see. She is carried into silence, like a lamb led into ritual slaughter. The hall echoes not with her voice, but with the scrape of steel against her teeth. Even the journey to the husband's castle could become an ordeal of humiliation. Travelers on old roads wrote of noble processions where brides sat stiffly in carriages, faces hidden behind veils, mouths sealed with devices that glimmered like ornaments. To strangers, it seemed like an odd form of jewelry. Only those close enough could see the redness at the edges of the lips, the way the jaw strained against the pressure. And always the key hung from the husband's belt, a cruel emblem of possession. This is the story of the silent bride. In the great estates of England, the practice took on another layer of meaning. Chronicles from the 13th century speak of bridal masks. Iron pieces fitted with ornamental filigree, so they appeared almost ceremonial. They were paraded before guests, as though they were tokens of wealth, gifts of craftsmanship, not instruments of subjugation. Yet beneath the gilded surface lay the same cruel purpose, to lock away the voice of the bride. One chronicler in Warwickshire described a young bride, Eleanor by name, whose family had married her into a powerful barony. On her wedding day, she was presented with a mask of bronze, polished so brightly it reflected the faces of the lords and ladies gathered in the hall. Her father called it a crown of virtue, but Eleanor, forced to wear it as the vows were spoken, trembled so violently that her veil shook like leaves in the wind. The guests applauded, mistaking her fear for reverence. In their eyes, silence meant purity. In hers, it meant terror. Some brides, according to scattered testimony, were forced to keep the gag in place until their first child was conceived. It was said that silence preserved the sanctity of the womb, that a woman who spoke too freely might spoil her seed with wayward thoughts. This grotesque logic echoes in old medical texts, where physicians wrote that the heat of the womb is tempered by the quiet of the tongue. In other words, a silent wife was a fertile wife. Yet, as with all instruments of cruelty, there were consequences, dark, unintended ones. Physicians quietly noted that prolonged wearing of the gag caused ulcers, infections, even death. One scribe from Rouen recorded a case where a young woman's jaw rotted from the pressure of rusted iron. Her death was explained away as God's judgment upon a disobedient tongue. No one questioned whether the device itself had killed her. Another story tells of a bride who, upon being freed after weeks of silence, could no longer speak at all. Her voice, once stolen by metal, never returned. Her husband praised this as divine favor, for now she was blessedly mute. And in this silence, he heard obedience. But were these isolated cruelties or a pattern hidden beneath centuries of erased testimony? That is the question which haunts us. For every explicit account, there are dozens of gaps, lines crossed out, records destroyed, relics quietly buried. Why such deliberate erasure if the stories were merely rumor? Some historians argue that the devices were too shameful, too damning to be preserved. Others whisper that secret collections of them still lie locked in vaults, kept from the eyes of the curious, guarded by families who would rather their ancestral cruelties remain forgotten. And yet evidence refuses to disappear entirely. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, some brides wore a metal mask to cover their mouths during their wedding ceremony? See, among the noble houses of Europe, there were families who turned the silencing of their brides into a tradition. They commissioned entire sets of bridal gags, some decorated with jewels, others with their coats of arms to be passed down through generations. To wear one of these was to be branded, to become another silent victim of a bloodline that valued obedience over all else. One such family was the Dalincans of northern France. For their brides, the gag was a finely wrought piece of metal that covered the face, leaving only the eyes exposed. It was called the veil of iron, and the bride was led to the altar wearing it, her lips locked fast until the groom removed the key after the ceremony. The Visconti of Italy took things even further. For them, the bride's silence was not just a symbol of submission, but a spectacle. At their feasts, the bride was brought in, still bound and gagged, seated at the head of the table, while servants whispered tales of her obedience. But it was in Germany where things became truly terrifying for the Wettin dynasty. The gag was used not just at the wedding, but throughout the marriage, every Sabbath. The Duchess was forced to kneel in church with a gag in her mouth, her lips locked in iron as she prayed. There are stories, too, of what happened when brides resisted. One legend tells of a Hungarian countess who tore the gag from her face and vanished. But most often, the women who refused to be silenced were punished severely. What if I told you there was a place where women were literally silenced, where their voices were literally taken away? And this wasn't some one-off horror story, but a widespread accepted practice. It sounds crazy, but in Spain, rumors tell of the bride's procession of silence, a tradition said to have taken place in Aragon. Entire groups of young brides, mouths sealed with thin bands of silver, were paraded through the streets on holy days as symbols of virtue. The townspeople would watch as these women walked in step, their silence thunderous in its uniformity. Priests blessed them as angels upon earth, their muteness praised as divine. It was pageantry of the grotesque, living women reduced to symbols, their pain erased by ritual. If the stories are true, those processions must have been terrifying to witness rows of young women, their eyes speaking the horror their mouths could not. And yet the true cruelty may not have been the iron itself, but the way it reshaped memory. Generations grew up believing that silence was beauty, that obedience was holiness, that pain was virtue. A bride who wept behind her gag was praised for her modesty. A wife who never spoke again was remembered as saintly. The devices did not merely silence individuals, they rewrote the very culture of womanhood, till silence itself became a tradition. Even centuries later, long after the iron had rusted away, the echo of that tradition still lingers in the way history remembers women as voiceless, obedient, passive. Perhaps the gag was never truly removed at all. Perhaps its shadow still lingers in the stories we tell. There are collectors even now who claim to own relics of these devices. Hushed conversations behind closed doors. They speak of pieces acquired from ruined estates, masks with rusted hinges, bands engraved with Latin prayers, delicate silver frames said to have once adorned noble brides. None of these objects are ever displayed publicly for fear of scandal. But those who have seen them whisper that the metal still carries a strange chill, as if it remembers the lips it once silenced. Whether these tales are true or inventions, the fact remains. People want to believe they exist. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all that silence. Once imposed, echoes across centuries, feeding our darkest curiosities. And so we arrive at the edge of the abyss. The possibility that this was never a handful of isolated cruelties, but a vast hidden tradition stretching across Europe. From France to Saxony, from England to Spain, noble families bound their brides in silence, each act justified by faith, by honor, by custom. But when so many voices are silenced, who is left to tell the story? Only fragments, rumors, shadows. And it is in these shadows that truth lingers, terrifying, half-visible, and impossible to fully grasp. Part 4. There are some who whisper that the silencing of brides was more than custom, more than cruelty, more even than the paranoia of jealous men. They suggest it was ritual, an initiation into a hidden order that stretched across noble bloodlines. The gags of iron and silver, they say, were not merely tools of obedience, but relics of a vow, part of a pact older than Christianity itself. An oath sealed not with words, but with silence. One of the strangest fragments comes from a manuscript discovered in a monastery near Avignon. The text, written in hurried Latin, describes a clandestine brotherhood known as Custodes Taciturnitatis, guardians of silence. They believed that the voice of women carried a power both sacred and dangerous, a power that could undo kingdoms if left unchecked. To them, binding the lips of brides was not just discipline, but devotion. They saw themselves as keepers of order, extinguishers of chaos. The manuscript hints that entire noble lineages pledged themselves to this brotherhood, and that the gag was their unspoken emblem. Whether invention or revelation, the words chill the blood. Through her silence, the world is preserved. Legends even claim that certain devices were kept not as ornaments, but as relics, guarded in locked chests within castles and abbeys. These relics, it was said, bore the memory of the women who wore them, soaked with prayers unsaid, screams unspoken. Some chroniclers insist they were passed down from mother to daughter, so that each generation might inherit not only a family name, but the iron that had silenced those before. Imagine such a legacy. A chest opened on the eve of a wedding, and inside, a rusted band once pressed against the lips of a grandmother, a great-grandmother. The weight of silence carried forward like a curse, but silence has a way of rotting from within. There are stories of noble houses that withered, their bloodlines extinguished, their estates abandoned to ruin. The peasants whispered that these families had been cursed by the very silence they worshipped. One tale tells of the von Hohenbergs of Swabia, who silenced their brides for generations. It is said that on a storm-filled night the halls of their castle rang with screams that seemed to come from nowhere. Echoing through stone, though every mouth was shut, servants fled, knights vanished, and by dawn the family was gone.
Ow.
No bodies were ever found. The castle still stands, a hollow shell. And travelers swear that if you walk its halls, you can hear voices whispering behind the walls, voices of brides long dead, finally breaking their silence. Historians scoff, of course. They call these tales Gothic inventions, the fantasies of peasants who love to curse their lords. But then there are the artifacts, rumors of them at least. A mask of iron unearthed near Ghent, shaped with terrifying precision to cover lips and teeth. A silver band inscribed with scripture, found in the cellar of a dissolved convent in Aragon. Each time the find vanishes, the object disappears into the hands of collectors or is quietly reburied. No museum displays them, no academic paper admits them, as though someone, even now, is determined to keep the silence unbroken. Did brides in medieval Europe really get married in iron masks? We'll explore the horrifying possibility that the tradition never truly ended. In hushed corners of Europe, there are whispers of a peculiar tradition that has survived through the ages. Whispers of aristocratic weddings where the bride, instead of saying her vows, is paraded before the altar with a sealed mouth, not in iron, but in gilded masks. These masks, silk-lined and jeweled, become a macabre plaything for the nobility, a perverse game of hide-and-seek, where the bride's face is concealed, not to protect her modesty, but to erase her identity. The guests applaud the spectacle, charmed by its strangeness, oblivious to the fact that they are witnessing a ghostly echo of an ancient practice designed to silence a woman's voice. But are these midnight whispers more than just fanciful tales? Could there still be corners of Europe where the veil is drawn not to reveal, but to conceal? What if the brutality of the iron gag is reborn as fashion, its sinister origins forgotten or deliberately ignored? Are we merely spectators of a macabre charade, laughing nervously at the bride's muffled cries, while the echoes of her silenced ancestors resonate in the rafters? And if such horrors still linger in the shadows, what else might we mistake for mere pageantry? For the truth is, silence is a persistent guest at history's feast. It lingers in the gaps of our chronicles, the missing pages of our collective memory. It watches us from the shadows of our museums, mocking our ignorance. There are even modern testimonies, letters, diaries that hint at the practice's longevity. In an 1847 publication, a British antiquarian recounted being shown an antique bridal gag by an aging countess. The device, she claimed, was used by her grandmother, who wore it in secret during her wedding. "It is not a myth," the countess whispered. "It is a memory." The antiquarian wrote no more, and the object he described was never seen again. Another account from the early 20th century tells of a collector in Vienna who kept a room lined with glass cases, each containing devices of iron, bronze, and silver. All bore mute testimony to a tradition that refused to die. But after his death, the collection vanished overnight, swallowed by darkness, leaving behind only rumors and speculation. So the question returns, was it real? Did medieval brides truly meet their fate in iron? Or have we woven a chilling narrative to explain the voicelessness of history? The evidence is fragmented, the artifacts hidden, the testimonies tantalizingly incomplete. But perhaps the most haunting answer is the silence itself. For silence, by its very nature, leaves little behind. It does not shout its truth, but whispers it on tombstones, leaving us to decipher the cryptic messages left behind. Silence can be a record, not of words, but of their absence. It speaks to us in the empty spaces where voices should be, in the sudden endings of sagas, in the abrupt closures of medieval manuscripts. These are the echoes of silenced voices, a chorus of the unheard. And in the spaces between the stories, we can almost hear them, the muffled sobs, the desperate pleas, silent screams of women whose voices were stolen, whose names were erased. Their stories may be lost to time, but their silence is a testament to a truth we must acknowledge. For silence, once forced, is never truly forgotten. It lingers, eternal like iron that never rusts, a chilling reminder of the lengths to which cruelty can go. And in the heart of that silence we find the most terrifying truth of all, that the nightmare of the Iron Bride may not be a fairy tale, but a haunting reality.